Old Testament, New Testament, and then I started to discover things as reading the New Testament. And I realized there was a James, the brother of Jesus. And this is because I was teaching it, and teaching the Gospels and teaching the letters of Paul. And, when you teach things in classes, term in, term in, term in, and term out, you get on top of them. If you're at Yale or Princeton, you're maybe teaching one course. You're not teaching all these things. I was teaching the New Testament, the scrolls, the Old Testament, and maybe something like modern Jewish thought, Zionism, or something like that, all in one term. Every term. Yeah. Every year. And I began to know this stuff like the palm of my hand. And I began to see things that no one else before me that I realized had seen very clearly. And the character that popped out at me was James, the brother of Jesus. Now, you're a Catholic. You probably didn't even realize till later on there was a person called James, the brother of Jesus. I hadn't realized it. And the point is that usually you speak about John and James, the sons of Zebedee. I like to say Zebedee, Zippity Doodah, or something like that. I'm not sure how real these people are. The point is that in the New Testament, and this is what I discovered for myself, there is literature and there is history. And the point is, literature is different than history. And what a lot of people mistake is literature for history. Now, I don't know how much of the Gospels are historical, and you were trying to find out, or how little. But the point is, it is literature, and very good literature, and captivating literature. So much so that it captivates hundreds of millions of people year in and year out. And to some extent, it's based on Greek literature. Because Hebrew gods didn't have children, didn't have sons. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have it the way it should be, in my view. You are a son of God. All the righteous ones are sons of God, if you are perfectly righteous. It has nothing to do with a Greek-type virgin birth scenario, etc., etc., etc. That's literature. Greco-Roman literature created in Rome. Yep. And other places under Pauline and Epaphroditus, and other Epaphroditus was Pauline's in Philippians apostle and companion that he sent to Rome as his own apostle. And Epaphroditus became the Flavian's secretary for Greek letters, and he's the one who published Josephus. And Josephus dedicates his works to Epaphroditus. I consider that to be the same Epaphroditus that Paul sends to Rome in the letter to the Philippians, I think it is. And you can see him mentioned there. So let us look at the difference between literature and history, and then I'll get your questions. Okay. I learned all this in the graduate schools and then the teaching I was doing. What happened was that if you look at things take the New Testament, the scrolls, I learned like the back of my hand, teaching them every term, just about. I don't think anyone knew the scrolls any better than me. And the New Testament, that's the key. So, how do you identify an historical part, and how do you identify literature? Yes. I just said people mistake literature for history. The point is the he, they, she, the third person parts are generally literary. That's fine. And that includes all of the Gospels. And much of the book of Acts. If you know your New Testament well enough, chapter 15, 16. The we document. Where suddenly the narrative changes to first person, the we document. And that's a big switch. Because that's right after James's directives to overseas communities, which is, by the way, still the basis of Islamic law, dietary law, and otherwise. Mm-hmm. Abstain from, maybe you know it better than me, things sacrificed to idols, strangled things, and fornication. The Muslims have that exactly. Strangled things is literally dead things, corpses, mm-hmm. things that have already died. That's why Jews always cut the throats of all the animals that they eat, because of those kinds of regulations. Well, James is given these basic directives, and you'll see that in the Quran over and over and over again. Muhammad has absorbed that from early Christianity. If you look at the Quran carefully, you'll find that I can't, at my age, I'm 81, do it anymore. So you have it there in the Quran, and I taught the Quran. I taught Islam every term too. Yeah, that was the fourth course, Islamic religion and culture. I taught it continually. So I knew all those areas, Dead Sea Scrolls, Islamic religion and culture, the New Testament, and so on and so forth. And so after chapter 15, when James gives his instructions to overseas communities, Acts switches narrative to I. And it's probably Luke's travel diary or someone like that. Mm-hmm. And when you get to 21 or so, it's Paul's last visit to Jerusalem. He comes and meets James. And then we don't know who this James is. He hasn't been introduced to us. But he's the leader of the church. Well, what happened to the other James of Zebedee? Well, he got beheaded or something like that. So we only from Galatians we know that this James is the brother of the Lord. Galatians, I think, 1 or 2. I'm going to get to that in a second. So then James is the head of what? Not the Pauline-type Christians, the keepers of the covenant. The keepers of the covenant. And so, according to Acts, and this is word for word almost, 21 onwards, James says to Paul, and James is clearly the leader. But Paul is, I think, obviously an historical figure too. But the point being, he says to him, well, we've heard rumors about you from Asia, meaning Asia Minor, Turkey, those kinds of places, and the Greek sort of areas around the Aegean region, that you've been teaching against the law, against the people, and against the temple, etc. And to show that there's no truth to these rumors we have heard, we want you to go into the temple, since they knew he'd raised a lot of money in those areas, and pay for the Nazarite oaths. Nazarite oath is a particularly Jewish religious law procedure. You can have a lifelong Nazarite or a temporary Nazarite. These are temporary Nazarite oaths, after which you pay certain expenses and shave your head. What do Muslims do after they go on the Hajj? Shave their heads. You see, these are temporary Nazarite oaths. So the point is that they have James, Paul, go into the temple. And Paul, nothing loath, I think he's with Luke or somebody, says, and they know he has money. James says, we have 4 people under Nazarite oath. We want you to pay the expenses relating to these. And Paul, nothing loath, to show there's no truth to these rumors, because Nazarite oath is a very arcane procedure in Jewish law, Old Testament law. There's lifelong Nazarites like Samson or whatever, and there's temporary Nazarites, a certain period, and then, as I said, and there's certain expenses, therefore, that the temple wants for these things. And Paul's considered to have money, because he'd been going around all these regions and raising money. He wouldn't come up to Jerusalem if he didn't have money. So what happened, he goes into the temple and pays for this. And people, it says in Acts, in the crowd that we document, recognize him and just yell the same thing as James somewhat had said about a chapter earlier, or some 10 or 20 verses earlier. This is the man teaching against our people, against our religion, against the law, against the temple, all over Asia. Don't forget, in Corinthians, Paul says, eat all the meat, around chapter 8, eat all the meat in the butcher shops. Everything is clean. Mm-hmm. You know, things like that, which would have driven Jews up the wall. Anyway, so was he doing this in Asia? I think it's clear from even the non-historical literary parts of Acts that he was. And so there's a huge riot in the temple, as you know from reading Acts, in the We document. And they take Paul and they throw him out of the temple and they close the door behind him. It says that's a phrase that's actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Lock the door behind him. And at that moment, Roman troops who were on the balustrades where they kept their positioning, because they had already conquered Israel, Palestine by that time in the previous century, and put the Herodians into power, Herod not being a Jew. Yep. But being an Idumean Arab sort of background person from the Gaza area and inland in what we would now call the Petra, Transjordan area. His family were from those kind of backgrounds. He was a Judaized. Well, I don't think he was ever Judaized. He used to build Greek temples, all kinds of things. Anyway, the Romans put him in as governor at some point in about 40 BC or something like that. And then his family continued in different jobs like that. Well, okay. So the Roman troops are on the balustrades. They come running down and they rescue Paul from the mob. Now, was this prearranged? Did James send him into the temple purposely to have him mobbed? I think perhaps yes. I can't say for sure. Did the Roman troops, were they prearranged to watch out for Paul in case something happened to him when he went into the temple? I think yes. I think yes. Because what they do is really absolutely mind-boggling, and it's we documented, I believe. They come and rescue him from the mob. And then they force the mob to listen to him give a preach or a speech. They force the mob to listen to him preach, if you want to call it that.
Sure.
And one of the words that is passed, he says to them, and they already seem to know it, "You arrest Romans, do you?" And he implies he's got a Roman citizenship. Where did he get his Roman citizenship from? I've written whole articles about this. Paul as Herodian.
Mm-hmm.
Why is Paul an Herodian? You've read Romans. At the end of Romans, he speaks, and I believe it's true, and these are now historical things. What are the historical things? A good many of Paul's letters, maybe not all, scholars debate it, but a good proportion are historical. Philippians, like, for instance, Galatians, and so on. And at the end of Romans, he sends greetings to his family members, and they're all Herodian names. And send my greetings to my kinsman, the littlest Herod, i.e. Herodian, Herodion, the littlest Herod. He says they're his kinsman. He admits the Herod that he's an Herodian. And I've written articles, Paul as Herodian. So. By the way, this little Herod, this Herodian, we know was killed in the eruption of Vesuvius in the Pompeii area. We know that from other historical sources. So the person he greets as his kinsman is actually one of the Herodian family living in Rome, where a lot of the Herodians had retreated to because of all the uprisings and struggles that were going on in Palestine at that time. So the soldiers not only rescue him, they give him armed escort down to Caesarea. Then the last chapters of Acts have to do with Paul in the governor's mansion to some extent in Caesarea, talking very intimately with the Roman governor in Palestine, like they were close bosom buddies, and he was willing to listen to anything Paul had to say. And then they escort him to Rome. Mm-hmm. And under, protective custody, not armed custody. And when he gets to Rome, he's free. And we never hear anything more about him in Acts. But I have traced other things about him in my books, which I won't go into here. So now, I think that is the difference between literature and history. For me, the literature is in Paul's letters and the latter part of Acts. No, pardon me, the history is there. The literature is in the Gospels and the earlier part of Acts, the narrative things. All the things you were worried about, Son of God and miraculous events and all these sorts of things, God having children and things of that kind. And when I found the Dead Sea Scrolls, what I realized is that Paul knew the Dead Sea Scrolls somewhat. And what Christianity has done, the part that was composed in Rome, Greco-Roman world, is reverse everything in the Dead Sea Scrolls. For instance, love your enemy. What do the scrolls say? I'm not advocating either. Love your enemy is a lovely word. I don't know any Christians who do it to any extent, except from some very pious ones. Mm-hmm. But the scrolls say, hate the sons of the pit. The scrolls say hate. The scrolls are not competing for a prize in good fellowship or love. No. What are the scrolls really involved in? We have a document from the Dead Sea Scroll called the War Scroll. The War Scroll. And scholars have called it the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. Mm-hmm. What is this War Scroll? Look, the reason I know all this is because I've taught it so often it comes out of my head, as you see.
Yeah.
Okay, what is the War Scroll? The War Scroll is a final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth. Now, the people at Qumran, as you called it, there were also apparently camps all across northern Syria. And there's a lot of argument of what Paul meant by Antioch, which Antioch there were in the empire, in the Greco Empire that was there. There were 3 or 4 Antiochs because the leader there admired his father, was called Antiochus, and named about 4 cities Antioch. I think that the New Testament has the wrong Antioch, and that what we're talking about is an Antioch in northern Syria, where Queen Helen of Adiabene, more where the Kurds are at the present time. There's still all kinds of trouble in northern Syria, as we can see, and Kurdistan. And for that area of northern Syria, there's, I think it's Antioch by Kalirho, it's called. There's another Antioch in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. I think that's the Antioch we're talking about. It's in my books. In any case, the point is they have camps all along into these areas. Qumran isn't their only camp. And so, what do these sectaries, if you want to call them that? They call themselves sons of Zadok. Zadok being David's high priest. It can also, ZDK means righteousness. Could also be sons of the Zadok, the righteous one. Mm-hmm. Anyway, sons of Zadok. Sons of Zadok, as opposed to the reigning high priests who were appointed by Romans and Herodians and the Pharisees and others, the Sadducees. You see, these are not Sadducees at Qumran, they are Sadducees. But people get confused because of Josephus tells us all the parties, and he's a Roman collaborator by this time. He goes to Rome, and he's adopted, sort of like Ben-Hur, into the Roman imperial family, you know. Mm-hmm. Anyway. The point, that's why it's called Flavius Josephus, because they are the Flavians. Because what happened was, when he was a young priest, and he tells us in his autobiography, also published by Epaphroditus in Rome, that they were in a cave in Galilee area, near the Sea of Galilee, near today's Tiberias and so on. Tiberias being the name of Roman emperor. What the Zealots were supposed to do, it was not surrender, but kill each other before they surrendered. So Josephus proudly tells this story in his Vita, his autobiography, that he and another fellow or two drew the straws, and they drew the short straws, so they were the ones who were going to do the killing. They killed their companions who were holding out in this cave, and then they went out and surrendered, and they proclaimed, I guess it was Vespasian or his son Titus, or one of them, the future emperor of Rome. And so he presented himself as a prophet. He not only broke his oath, killed his companions, but surrendered to the Romans, proclaimed them the world ruler that would come out of Palestine. So that's why it's called Flavius. So like Ben-Hur, adopted into the Roman imperial family, the Flavians, Vespasian's family, mm-hmm. who took over the imperialship. Well, okay, so our scholars take the Sadducees and the Pharisees from Josephus and the Essenes. So they think of peaceful Essenes and so on. There's nothing peaceful about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The very opposite. They are extremely aggressive. I wouldn't say warlike, but there is a war scroll.
Yep.
Let me finish this now, can I?
For sure, yeah.
So what happens? What happens? In this war scroll, these people are not so stupid. They knew that they couldn't defeat Rome themselves. What are they, a handful of 300, 400, 500, 600 people? Who knows how many they had? They probably weren't even very good warriors. They felt that they could only defeat Rome with an atom bomb, a nuclear bomb. Now, they're very imaginative. I think this is very impressive. I don't necessarily believe any of it, mm-hmm. but I'm impressed by their imaginativeness. They think that the only way they can defeat Rome is that the heavenly host of angels, which they believed in implicitly,
right,
would join their camps, their desert camps, and lead the final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth. Now, the heavenly host of angels could easily defeat the Roman Empire. But how do you bring the heavenly host into your camps? You know how? You have to be perfectly righteous. There should be no fornication, as James says in those instructions. You have to be utterly pure, because according to their imagination, and I don't have any proof of any of this, but that's how they thought, the heavenly hosts cannot abide human impurity, so there can be no fornication in the camps. So if the angels are going to come down and into the camps and fight for them, they can't encounter human impurity in their camps. Their camps have to be perfectly righteous and perfectly pure. That's why they bathed every day. That's why you have someone like John the Baptist, John the Bather. Now, that's an integral part of Christianity now. But I do actually honestly believe, we've seen the bathing pools at Qumran. They bathed every single day. They did not copulate. They did not have women in the camps. All those things. So they felt if they were perfectly righteous, the heavenly hosts would join them in the final apocalyptic war against Rome. Their camps had to be perfectly pure from Qumran all the way up to northern Syria. Now what happened? What happened? A Christian historian, a Roman Christian, well, I don't know how Christian, but his name was Hippolytus, Hippolytus, gives another picture of Essenes than Josephus. What does he have? What does he tell us about Essenes? There were 4 groups of Essenes, not just this one that everyone thinks of, these peaceful Essenes who turn the other cheek, or like Christians that we know, all that kind of thing. By the way, I do think Paul was at Qumran at one point and was expelled. That's another idea of mine. I really do, because he knows a lot about the doctrines at Qumran. Mm-hmm. And I do think Paul's historical, and I think his letters are historical. So I've drawn the line between history and literature. I'm not criticizing the gospel literature. I just think it's Greco-Roman type literature where gods have children and are supernatural and all this sort of thing. And, but you see, pure foods don't matter a thing. I'll give you something at the very end that'll blow your mind, I think. Something that is the basis of this book here. See, I wrote these 2 books from my courses. This here, James, the brother of Jesus, Penguin, 1,000 pages. In my life when I was young, I loved Penguin books. I never thought I would see Robert Eisenman writing a 1,000-page Penguin book. These are all the pages that were cut out of that book, the New Testament Code. Another 1,000 pages. The point is that it's not, I wanted to call it the New Covenant Code. But the point is, I felt if I called it the New Covenant Code, no one would know what the hell that was. Mm-hmm. So I thought the New Testament Code would be a more popular title. I think that's a subtitle here. The Cup of the Lord, the Damascus Covenant, and the Blood of Christ. I do have a subtitle with the Damascus Covenant in it here, and I'll explain what that is in a second. By the way, since we're showing books, I should maybe show, this is my most recent one, just out this year, about how I broke or was involved in breaking the Dead Sea Scroll monopoly. It's called Breaking the Dead Sea Scroll Monopoly, a new interpretation of the Messianic movement in Palestine. Okay, let's go back now. So, they thought that the camps had to be perfectly righteous. Hippolytus says there are 4 groups of Essenes. Mm-hmm. There's a regular Josephus kind of Essenes that we all know about, these peaceful, friendly, Essenes that are, full of brotherly love and don't have any aggression and then turn the other cheek, whatever. Then there are marrying Essenes that we know are not anything to do with the Qumran group. And then there are 2 others. This is from Hippolytus, 2nd century. Zealot Essenes and Sicarii Essenes. Well, what do you mean, Zealot Essenes? Josephus didn't tell us anything about Zealot Essenes. And Sicarii Essenes. Who are the Sicarii? Well, if you know anything, if you've been to Palestine or Israel, there's a famous fortress, used to be a Herodian palace, called Masada, meaning plateau rock. Yeah. Masada was where the Sicarii retreated and finally committed mass suicide in the way they were supposed to do before they surrendered to the Romans. They killed their own children, and they surrendered, and they killed themselves. After the ramp, which the Romans were building with slave labor, was finished around 73 A.D., and the war against Rome that started in 66 to 70 was over, but Masada was the final holdout where the Sicarii went. So the point is, there are Sicarii Essenes, Hippolytus tells us. And the point is that I don't remember the passage so well anymore, but it's in my books. But the point is that Hippolytus tells us these Sicarii Essenes, Josephus says they're called Sicarii, not Essenes, just Sicarii, because of the Sika, the Roman dagger they carried under their cloak, which they would assassinate their victims with, the Romans. But I have a feeling it could also be the circumciser's knife. And they believed in forcible circumcision. If a prisoner was willing to come over, they would be willing to forcibly circumcise.
Yeah.
I'm not for or against these things. I'm just telling you what existed.
Right.
So I'm not sure they were called Sicarii because they were assassins or because they were forcible circumcisers. Josephus has them as Sicarii because of the knife, the assassin's knife. I'm not sure if it wasn't the circumciser's knife. Whatever they were the Sicarii, the most extreme group of Essenes, and so on. They're the people that retreated to Masada. They're the people that committed mass suicide there. And then you have these Zealot. These Zealot Essenes that Hippolytus tells us about. The Zealots were the people who started the war against Rome. The Sicarii were the extreme group of Zealots. So, what I'm trying to say is that I think the scrolls are the literature of the war against Rome. There's earlier things, too. Every book of the Old Testament except Ruth has been found there. Why wasn't Ruth found there? Can you tell me?
I can't.
Well,
I cannot.
Ruth marries a foreign king. She does it according to the book to save her people. But in any case, she marries a foreign king. Whatever you want to say, the scroll sectaries would not approve of that action, even to save the people. That he was not a circumcised person, and so on. So whatever, I can't go into their mindset. That's why I think Ruth wasn't found there. I don't mind the book. It isn't a bad book. But I don't think it's, it isn't something that they would approve of there. So in any case, all that, but there's their own literatures there, the Dead Sea Scroll literature. And here I'm going to get to one of the most important documents that we have at Qumran, mostly in fragmentary form, is what we have come to be called the Damascus Document. Okay. The longest one, it's in all the collections. You've heard of it, I'm sure. How come we have such a good copy of it? Because somewhere in the Middle Ages, someone found a copy of it down in Egypt and recopied it. And we have a very good, it was in the Cairo Geniza, which is where they put old manuscripts in synagogues. And when the British took those areas, one of the famous British scholars found it and brought it out and translated it again, and we know exactly what it says. And it's an incredible document. But what's one of the most incredible things is column 6. It talks about the desert camps. And guess what? This is what I mean. Raising the new covenant in the land of Damascus. So we're talking about going past Damascus into these desert camps and raising the new covenant there. The new covenant, Christianity thinks it's the new covenant. The scrolls think they're the new covenant, and what they're raised is going to be raised in the land of Damascus. So let me go to the Last Supper in the Gospels, if I can.
Yes.
Jesus is presented as being at the Last Supper with his disciples, right? Mm-hmm. And most of the Gospels agree on it, as some variations. And he takes the cup, and he pours the wine, and he raises it up. And I don't have it in front of me, but it says something like, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood." Mm-hmm. This is the cup of the new covenant. Now, this is all symbolic, Greek-type literature, if you want to call it that. It's not in the not in Paul's letters as such. This is the cup of. Now, what I claim, this is a parody of column 6 of the Damascus Document. Why? We're going to raise up the law again in the land of Damascus. Raise up the covenant again. Raise up the new covenant. So cup in Hebrew is what? Kos. Jews weren't allowed to drink blood, whatever, symbolically or otherwise. The opposite. Pauline Christians were allowed to do that. Paul was, but not Jews. So, Jews go so far as to drain out meats without a bit of blood in it. Arabs follow them. Okay, so, what's the Hebrew word for blood? Dam. Damascus.
Wow.
So I think this is where we're getting this Last Supper verse for Jesus. Dam and cuss. This is the cup, cuss, of the new covenant in my dam, in my blood. And drink this and you will say blah, 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 blah. But the point is it's a variation and a parody of column 6 of the Damascus document to raise up the new covenant of the law, that is, in the land of Damascus. Cuss and Damascus. The land of Damascus. So that's the whole subject of that second book of mine, that 1,000-page book, and so on. So I think I've given you a good enough introduction here to hear how I came to all of these ideas. But let me tell you, I came to all of these ideas, that particular presentation I just gave you is all laid out in this book here. And I fell out with Penguin Books on this because the Cup of the Lord, the Damascus Covenant, and the Blood of Christ. And as you say, I think the last chapter here is called, let me see if I can get you the last chapter in this big fat book here.
This is the New Testament code.
Yeah, the New Testament code. James and Qumran, the last chapter. The Cup of the New Covenant in His Blood. Chapter 27. The Cup of the New Covenant in His blood. That is the next to last chapter. Explains about everything you need to know on that particular subject from the point of view of this particular book. I mean, you don't have to believe that or anything like that. So my publishers at Penguin didn't like that. They wanted me to write something about Abraham. He was in the news around this book, James, the Brother of Jesus, still out, by the way, in paperback, came out around 1998. People were talking on TV about Abraham a lot, archaeological shows. They wanted me to write a book about Abraham. I didn't want to write a book. I'd cut 1,000 pages, 1,500 pages out of this book. I wanted to get those pages put together. They wouldn't publish those pages, and my publisher, who had been with me, died in the meantime, and someone else took over, and they became a bit hostile on that issue, and I had to publish it elsewhere. But for me, I had to finish it. I couldn't start writing a book about Abraham, and I didn't have anything serious to say about Abraham as such, because I'm in this area of the Intertestament period, or the Scroll period, or the Book of Acts period, or Paul's letters period, or James, the brother of the Lord period, and I think if you remember the history, James is mentioned in Josephus. That's what's crazy. The funny thing is, I think he's not mentioned in Josephus' first book, The War. He's mentioned in his second book, The Antiquities, and he gives the reason and date of his death. And no Christian stuff has any of this. You don't have it anywhere else. It's in the Antiquities, and he's 62 A.D. And if you do your calculations carefully, that's 3.5 years before the outbreak of the war against Rome. Look at your book of Daniel. A time, 2 times and a half. No one knows what that's supposed to mean, but these people had their own interpretation of it. A time, 2 times and a half. In my view, that's how they calculated when the war against Rome would break out after the death of James. And so he has that James went in to the inner sanctum of the temple and did what he was called the Tzaddik, the righteous one, the teacher in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran. In all the literature is called the Moreh Ascetic, the teacher of righteousness, or the righteous teacher.
Yeah.
And every time Tzaddik, righteous one, even in Kabbalah, is mentioned in the biblical text that they're interpreting. I have a book, like, for instance, on something similar to that subject. I can't see it here. Oh, yeah, this book here. James the Just in the Habakkuk Pesha. And every time in Habakkuk the prophet, the Tzaddik is mentioned, it's the righteous teacher who they talk about. They give the interpretation in terms of the righteous teacher. So the point is that James is the Tzaddik, or the righteous one, and 3.5 years after his death, the war breaks out against Rome. That's how I figure it out. That's what it means to me. And I think that's how they calculated it too. And, Josephus gives us at least that data, that we know the date that he was stoned and why he was stoned. He was stoned because he went into the inner sanctum of the temple. See, at Qumran, all the righteous ones are priests. You don't have to be born a priest to be a priest. You just have to be perfectly righteous. James was perfectly righteous. He went into the inner sanctum of the temple, that would be like on Yom Kippur or something, and made an atonement on behalf of the people, a perfectly righteous atonement. Now, a Herodian high priest, a Sadducee, as they're called by most people, couldn't go into the inner sanctum of the temple and make a perfectly righteous atonement. But James, the Tzaddik, could, and he did. And because of this, he was subjected to a blasphemy trial for having entered the inner sanctum, and he was stoned and killed like that by the Pharisee Sadducee establishment, Herodian Pharisee Sadducee establishment. Now in the New Testament, Jesus is Herod's wife has a dream or something, and she doesn't want this man to be crucified because he comes to her in a dream. Now, this is literature, and it's the Jews who want Jesus crucified, and so on and so forth. That isn't the way things work. Pontius Pilate, Josephus even tells us, crucified more people than any other Roman governor. I think that is known. I think he says at one point he crucified so many people there wasn't enough wood for the crosses nor enough space to hang them up on. It isn't that Pontius Pilate's wife didn't want Jesus to be crucified and that the Jews did. That's all literature. And I hate to say it, it's the fountain, in my view, of anti-Semitism. But even the Jews don't know it. They don't read the New Testament. They believe what the Christians tell them. So, I can't tell any Jews this either, because they have no idea what the New Testament is about or what the origins of anything is. But Christians could easily deal with this if they understood what was going on here in this literature. But in the history, we know very well what's going on. James is stoned in 62, and the uprising breaks out 3.5 years later. Book of Daniel they took seriously. It's at Qumran, 2.5 times, and then the Sicarii, Essenes, or Sicarii, the cutthroats or the circumcisers, committed suicide in the final battle of the war in 73 at Masada. That's my sketch of the history.